Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Farah Sharif, and I'm the Director for the Center for Research for Teacher Education and Development here at the University of Alberta, located on the unceded lands of the Papasteo Nation, the Miskwichi-Waskahigan, and the homeland of Métis Nation. This land was taken. In 1877, the Papas-Chase Nation entered Treaty 6, and just 11 years later, they were forcibly displaced. That history is not the past, it shapes the present. And telling this truth depends on what brings us here tonight. Freedom of expression and academic freedom, the cornerstones of public education and a healthy democracy. Without them, difficult histories are softened or silenced, curriculum becomes control, and the voices most needed are pushed further to the margins. So this is not just an acknowledgement, it is a responsibility. As an educator, I see freedom of expression as a shared responsibility to know the truth, to question the truth, to challenge injustice, and to hold space for discomfort. Because that is where learning begins and where democracy is strengthened. So tonight, I invite you to reflect. What does it mean to defend freedom of expression, even when it's uncomfortable? Whose voices are we making space for, and whose are still missing? Because reconciliation requires truth, and truth requires freedom. As the late Justice Murray Sinclair reminds us, education is what got us here, and education is what will get us out. Tonight, at a time when expressive freedom is facing sustained global challenges, Dr. James Turk, Director for the Center for Freedom of Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University, will speak on the essential role of expressive freedom in advancing equity, social justice, and democracy. His keynote will be followed by a panel featuring Karla Palichuk, Director of the Yellowhead Regional Library, Jodi Schwartz, an Alberta teacher, and her students Muen Li and Tim Chi. Together, they will reflect on the impacts of the Alberta Minister of Education order, which has led to the most extensive censorship of school library materials in Canadian history. And the event will conclude with an audience Q&A.
Thanks, Farah. Welcome to this timely, important, collaborative advocacy event that is co-sponsored by the School of Library and Information Studies here at the University of Alberta. I'm Dr. Kenneth Garapi, Solicitor Director and Associate Professor. Regarding logistics, anyone participating in this evening's event can post to the Q&A feature anytime. Questions will be addressed, as many as time permits, in the last segment. However, questions can be posted to the moderator, who is Dr. Tony Samet, at any point using the Q&A feature. Please note that there is no chat feature. Please also note that the event is both sponsored and recorded, and it will be available on the CFE website, CFE YouTube, and linked to the SLIS and CRTED websites. I'd like to introduce our Q&A moderator, Dr. Tony Samet, who is Professor Emerita of the University of Alberta, having served the School of Library and Information Studies for more than 30 years. She is also Scholar in Residence at the Center for Free Expression. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Ken. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our lead off this evening, Dr. James L. Turk. Jim, as you've heard, is the Director of the Center for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University. As you may be aware, Jim works tirelessly on expressive freedom and censorship concerns across sectors, including in the library community. He's a conditional advocate for intellectual freedom, for example, in the current Alberta book ban battle. I trust many of you have encountered Jim's thoughts in the media. And over to you, Jim. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you, Tony. It's a delight to be here, and thank you, Farah and Kenneth. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to use a PowerPoint in my presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen, and Hope this all works. Just give me a second. It should appear on your screen momentarily, hopefully. And if I do this, you'll be able to see the, yeah. So tonight, as the title suggests, I'm going to be talking to you about freedom of expression, public education, and democracy. And I'm going to start with democracy, but before I do that, I just want to be clear that in talking about freedom of expression, as it's defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and is understood broadly, it encompasses two things: not only the freedom to express yourself, but also the right to seek and receive information. So in that sense, it's the right to speak as well as the right to hear. And I much prefer our usage of the term freedom of expression than the Americans' use of freedom of speech, because expression can be in many formats. It can be orally, but it can be in music, it can be in dance, it can be in art. There's a variety of formats. And freedom of expression covers the protection of all those forms of expression, as well as, I say, the right to seek and receive information. But we're going to start primarily tonight with democracy. And this is just a word cloud with a lot of words associated with democracy. Oftentimes people understand democracy to be about elections and voting, which it is, but it's much more than that. Others understand it to be about law and how we're subject to law and we're all equal before the law. And it's also that. But primarily in its heart, democracy is about an ongoing public discourse as to what's legitimate and what's not legitimate in a society, a discourse that can never be brought to an end by a majority or by a government. So a government, in my province, I live in Ontario, we have a conservative majority government that got elected with about 40% of the votes, and they can pass laws and we're obligated to obey those laws. But in a democratic society, we never lose our right to challenge those laws, to challenge the government, to protest, to try to bring about changes, try to get a different government elected. In other words, democracy is a form of government in which the majority cannot silence the minority. That's what freedom of expression is about, and that's what fundamental democratic rights are about. Now, public discourse takes many formats, and Farah has asked me to talk about an experience I had many years ago that I've never spoken about in public before, so I'm a little nervous talking about it. When I was a young student at university, I had a chance to join what turned out to be one of the iconic marches in the United States history. And that was a march, a civil rights march organized by Martin Luther King from Selma, Alabama to the capital, Montgomery. The context of that march is there had been a march that his Southern Christian Leadership Conference had from Selma. And to get out of Selma, it's by a river, you have to cross the Pettus Bridge. And there were about 600 marchers. And when they crossed the bridge, they were attacked by the police and armed citizens. There were 600 of them. 100 of them were hospitalized, many with very serious injuries, fractured skulls, broken legs. They retreated. It caused horror across the United States as the imagery was conveyed on television screens. 2 days later, Martin Luther King, who had come there, said he was going to lead a march to carry on what they had begun. The local police and judge invited every white male citizen to come and be deputized, and they stood at the opposite end of the bridge to deal with the marchers should they try to march again. So King led the march, and when they got to the police and the armed citizenry, they opened up to let them through, and Martin Luther King figured this was a trap and they were going to get beaten again. So he turned around and went back and then sought an injunction from a federal judge to allow a march to take place, which was scheduled for 2 weeks hence. The judge initially turned it down, but then granted it. And in the meantime, the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, was quite concerned about what happened. I mean, the outrage in much of the country over the treatment of the marchers was quite extreme. And so he nationalized the Alabama National Guard and sent in 1,000 other federal agents and FBI agents to line the entire 50-mile route from Selma to Montgomery. And so these are some images of that march that took place literally started on March 21st and went to March 25th. Whoops, sorry. Something went wrong there. Give me a second, please. Sorry for the technical problem. Let's try it again. Just skip through this. And there's the march with the marchers coming out. There were about 8,000 marchers at the beginning. By the time we got to Montgomery, there were 25,000. As I was walking in this, I was never happier in my life to see soldiers, because all along the route were Alabama citizens who were just furious at us, furious at the notion of desegregation. And even though a few of the marchers were killed as they left the march or whatever, by and large, it was a safe event, and it was only possible because of the National Guard that were there. You can see the marchers going along. And then we arrived in Montgomery. By that point, there were 25,000 of us. And Martin Luther King gave a very famous speech of his at the state capitol building called "How Long, Not Long." And in that speech, he said, "They told us we wouldn't get here. And there were those who said that we would get here only over their dead bodies. But all the world today knows that we are here, and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying, we ain't going to let nobody turn us around." Now, that march was so powerful that it caused the Congress of the United States to pass the Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed the right to vote, which was theoretically awarded to all blacks of the United States by the 15th Amendment almost 100 years earlier. But it took this form of protest, this form of political discourse, of bringing the issue forward in this dramatic way to make that right a reality. And I tell that story only to say that public discourse takes many forms. It can take forms of discussions in legislatures. It can take the form of debates of candidates for elections. It takes form in discussions leading up to our voting, but it also takes place in classrooms. It takes place in other settings, like this is a form of political discourse. And it takes place as well around kitchen tables. But it also takes place in demonstrations, in protests, in the student encampments at the University of Alberta, and at encampments at 24 other universities across the country. So those are all forms of participating in public discourse. And that really is the heart of democracy. And losing that right to engage in discourse is how we turn from democracy to authoritarianism. Now, I'm starting by talking about democracy because it's in real trouble, as I will describe in a moment. But from the march that I was on many years ago, it politicized me in a fundamental way, and I learned two basic lessons. The first was that robust discourse, and that kind of march is a form of robust discourse, as is an encampment, as is demonstrations and protests, is essential for realizing democratic rights for the marginalized and disadvantaged in society. And secondly, that the right to freedom of expression, which makes robust discourse possible, that constitutional protection for freedom of expression, is therefore essential for achieving greater social justice in a democracy. So often, freedom of expression, especially when articulated by libertarians, is counterposed to social justice, when in fact, without a question, the ability to achieve social justice is impossible without protections for freedom of expression. Now, I began with democracy because we're in a very difficult period. There's the most authoritative research organization on democracy in the world is the VDEM Institute, which is in Sweden. It's associated with Gothenburg University and several other universities. It has about 3,000 to 4,000 people and researchers and others involved in assessing the state of democracy in 200 countries around the world. And it just issued its annual report last week. And its overall picture was pretty negative as to what they found. So this is just a few highlights. The democracy now actually the data, it comes out in 2026, the data are for 2024-25. So it's always a year behind. Democracy is back to 1978 levels for the average global citizen. They add that the gains of the third wave of democratization, which started in 1974 when the dictatorship in Portugal was finally overthrown, are almost eradicated. The world has never before seen as many countries autocratizing at the same time as during the last few years, during the third wave of autocratization. And then they provide this chart giving an overview of what they found and how things are different now from what they were 20 years ago. So the number of countries that were democratizing 25 years ago were 27. Today it's 18. Freedom of expression was deteriorating 20 years ago in only 7 countries. Today it's deteriorating in 44 countries. The quality of elections was deteriorating in 11 countries 20 years ago, and it's deteriorating in 22 today. The number of countries that are turning from democracy to autocracy in 20 years ago were 12. Today it's 44. Freedom of expression was improving in 25 countries 20 years ago. It's only improving in 11 today. And the quality of elections was improving in 31 countries 25 years ago, and it's only improving in 7 today. Now, they have a whole focus in this report. Almost a quarter of the report is about the autocratization in the United States. They talk about President Trump's second term can be summarized as a rapid and aggressive concentration of powers in the presidency. The speed with which American democracy is currently dismantling is unprecedented in modern history, and that civil rights and equality before the law and freedom of expression are now at their lowest level in more than 60 years. I did my undergraduate work at Harvard, and I received information from the university that as a result of the Trump administration's ending of affirmative action and other related efforts to make universities more equitable and accessible, the percentage of Blacks at Harvard today is at the level it was before the civil rights movement that I participated in many years ago. Now, I don't want to talk about the United States. I want to talk about what this report has to say for Canada. And so what I'm going to do is look at Canada's ranking over the last 10 years. The report has 5 dimensions of democracies that it looks at. And the first is what is called the Electoral Democracy Index. And this is a measure of the extent to which political leaders are selected through competitive, inclusive, and fair and free elections, ensuring accountability. And Canada was 7th in the world 10 years ago and is now 23rd. We've dropped 16 places. The second component is called the Liberal Component Index. And what it measures is the extent to which a country's government respects civil liberties, the rule of law, and institutional checks and balances on the executive. So in our case, on the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office. And it captures liberal democratic principles such as judicial independence, legislative constraints on the executive, protections for basic human rights and freedoms. Canada was 21st in the world 10 years ago. It's 31st today. The third index is egalitarian component index. And that measures the extent to which all citizens and social groups enjoy equal participation, representation, legal protection, and influence over policymaking. It's made up of 2 sub-indexes, one which assesses whether rights and liberties are uniformly guaranteed by the state across all social groups, and secondly, the equal distribution of resources, and that is, it evaluates the degree to which individuals have equal access to the basic resources, education, healthcare, economic opportunity, needed to effectively exercise their rights and influence political decisions. Canada was 41st 10 years ago and is 62nd in the world now, a drop of 21 positions. The next index is the Participatory Component Index, and that captures the extent to which citizens actively participate in political processes, both electoral and non-electoral. It emphasizes engagement beyond voting, focusing on direct democracy, civil society involvement, and subnational governance. Canada was first in the world 10 years ago, and now we're 25th. And finally, and perhaps most relevant to the importance I'm attributing to discourse, political and public discourse, is the Deliberative Component Index. It measures the extent to which political decisions are driven by reasoned public discourse focused on the common good rather than on coercion, censorship, manipulation, and narrow interests. It has 5 dimensions. One is the extent to which elites provide public evidence-based rationales for policies, the degree to which decisions are oriented to societal well-being, the willingness to acknowledge and engage with opposing views, the inclusiveness of diverse societal groups in policy discussions, and the prevalence of grassroots independent public deliberation. Canada was 6th in the world 10 years ago. We're now 52nd. Now, I find these conclusions by the most reputable public research institute dealing with assessing democracy worldwide to be deeply troubling. And so I'm concerned greatly about the United States, and I'm not suggesting we're anywhere like that. There are serious issues that we have to grapple with which have a bearing on what we're talking about tonight. Now, as you all know, we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the Charter rights fall into 7 categories. Fundamental freedoms, and those are in Section 2 of the Charter: the freedom of conscience and religion, the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. And then Sections 3 to 5 deal with our democratic rights. Section 6 deals with our mobility rights. Section 7 deals with our legal rights, everything from a right to be secure against unreasonable search and seizure, not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned, the right to a lawyer if arrested and to be dealt with promptly and be given the reasons, and so forth. Section 15 deals with equality rights. Sections 16 to 22 deal with official language rights, and 23 deals with minority language rights. But our charter has a poison pill in it, and that's Section 33, that gives Parliament or the legislature of any province the right expressly to declare that any act they pass that is in violation of the charter, they can invoke the notwithstanding clause to override the charter protections for any violation of the charter that would be in Section 2 or in Section 7 to 15. In other words, our 4 fundamental freedoms of religion, of expression, of peaceful assembly, and of association can be taken away by any government, can pass laws that are directly in violation of those rights, and if they invoke the notwithstanding clause, we have no rights, or our legal rights to be presumed innocent if arrested, to have a right to a lawyer, to have a right to know what our charges are against us, to be protected against cruel and unusual punishment. All those rights can be taken away by a government in Canada if they invoke the charter. So we have rights that are quite vulnerable in Canada. Now, at the time this was agreed to, in 1982, when the charter was adopted, a number of the provinces insisted that the notwithstanding clause had to be a feature or there was going to be no charter. And it was conventional wisdom at the time that this was a provision that would just never be used. I mean, it was theoretically there, but it would never be used. Well, it was used, and now we're seeing it used increasingly. These are just fairly recent uses of it, and one of them is particularly appropriate, and that's Bill 21, which is probably the most serious of all these. This was an act that was adopted by the government of Quebec. Laicity refers to secularism. So it's an act to ensure that Quebec is a secular society. But what in fact it is, it's aimed primarily at Muslim women, but it says that anyone who wears any religious clothing or imagery or artifact on their body cannot be a teacher, a principal or a vice principal in a school, a police officer, a judge, or any other court official, a member of a government commission, or a labor mediator, or a lawyer for the government. And then in November, they introduced a Bill 9 to extend it to include anyone who works in a subsidized daycare. And it also bars collective religious practices. There can be no praying in public spaces like parks. It also prevents students and staff from wearing face coverings in daycare, all the way through to post-secondary education. And it restricts public prayer and the limit on the exclusive offering of religion-based menus like kosher or halal meals in public institutions. So it's a gross violation of several of our fundamental freedoms of religion and our freedoms of equality under Section 15 of the Charter. And that's being challenged in the Supreme Court beginning today. Typically, a Supreme Court case goes for 1 day, occasionally 2 days. They set aside the whole week this week to deal with this case. There's only one other case in the history of Canada that's been given this attention. And other provinces are using it to take away the rights largely of LGBTQ and trans people. As you can see, the Bill 137 in Saskatchewan, and then 4 uses of it in the last 2 years in Alberta with regard to ending the teacher strike in contravention of Section 2 of the Charter, and then using it with regard to 3 laws to restrict the rights of trans people in Alberta. So we have a fragile democracy in a lot of ways. And it's further, one can see it further with regard to what the federal government, since the Carney government has been elected, it has released a literal fire hose of bills, arguably all of which have elements that are unconstitutional. Bill C2, the Strong Borders Bill, which takes away all sorts of rights of refugees and of, anyways, I could give this whole talk on each of these bills. The One Canada Economy Act, which allows environmental protections and Aboriginal rights to be overridden. A cybersecurity bill, which if passed would interfere grossly with the privacy of Canadians and obligate our security officials to exchange information it has about any citizen in Canada with any other signatory to this cybersecurity agreement, which are most countries in the world. The Combating Hate Act, which has 4 parts, each of which, in my view, is unconstitutional or a gross violation of our civil liberties. Bill C12 is a version that pulled out key elements from C2, which has just recently passed. A Bail and Sentencing Reform Act, which is a pretty clear violation of our Constitution, and a Lawful Access Act. So we have at the federal level a willingness to intrude in unprecedented ways on a scale that's unprecedented with regard to basic civil liberties and human rights in Canada. So the issue of democracy and liberties is a real issue for us in a way that most of us don't realize. So a note before I move on about democracy is to say by its very nature, democracy is never secure. Democracy is a process, it's not an endpoint. So its advancement is dependent on an engaged, informed population with the means to be participants in public discourse that is at democracy's heart. The constitutional protection of freedom of expression, which helps protect and make possible our other rights, is central. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes a whole range of rights, as does our charter. But it's arguable those rights cannot be turned into a reality if we don't have the right to freedom of expression. Because that right to challenge, to speak out about issues is the only way we can hold a government accountable for ensuring that all their other rights are protected. And right now, there's serious questions about the strength of our democracy and much more serious ones about the strength of American democracy and many other countries around the world. Now, another protection for democracy is a free and independent media. And then there are two others that I want to focus on, and those are public schools and public libraries. Public schools are so vital because that's where democracy takes shape. The decision many decades ago to have universal elementary and then secondary education provides the opportunity for people to become informed so that they can be active and informed participants in our society. It's a foundational base for a democratic society. And libraries are equally important. The phrase democracy lives here was a suggestion that Vickery Bowles, who was the longtime city librarian at the Toronto Public Library, suggested should be on the big display in the middle of their atrium. They have a 6-story atrium in the main branch of the Toronto Public Library, because libraries, public libraries are a really unique public space. I would argue they're the last truly public space in most of our communities, because there are lots of public spaces like the Ontario Legislature, which is a public space. When I go into it, I have to go through a search, and then I'm directed to a security desk where I have to give over my passport or my driver's license, and they keep it and give me a pass to go to the room I'm to go to and tell me how to get there. And if I go 6 feet out of the way, a nice man comes over and says, "Can I help you, sir?" So there are public spaces like that, but the library is the one place where everyone in the community is welcome. Everyone has access to a huge number of resources. And I'm not talking just about the books. I'm talking about an incredible array of resources that are vital in a democratic society. So the focus and function of these two bodies is so crucial, and yet they're coming under attack. Now, libraries have an absolute and clear commitment to intellectual freedom. I'm just going to cite the Canadian elements from the Canadian Federation of Library Association statement. It says libraries have a core responsibility to safeguard and facilitate access to constitutionally protected expressions of knowledge, imagination, ideas, and opinion, including those which some individuals and groups consider unconventional, unpopular, or unacceptable. All persons in Canada have a fundamental right subject only to the Constitution and the law to have access to the full range of knowledge, imagination, ideas, and opinion, and to express their thoughts publicly. Only the courts may abridge free expression rights in Canada. Now, there are a lot of people who are unhappy with that view. The Toronto Public Library had a 2-year public campaign on intellectual freedom. And my favorite sign in that campaign was, "I'm all for free speech, but." And the but comes in when there's expression which is legal. I mean, there are limits to freedom of expression. I can't punch somebody in the face and say, "I'm just expressing my disdain for your viewpoint." I can't threaten violence. I'm going to kill you if you say that. I can't engage in harassment or discrimination. I can't defame them. I mean, there are a variety of limits. But these are folks who find there are what they consider dangerous ideas that are legal, and therefore feel they have a right to challenge, try to censor those ideas, whether it be in the library or in schools. And there's quite a number of groups that are of this sort. The strongest one in the United States now is something called Moms for Liberty, which some of you may have heard of. The closest equivalent we have to that in Canada is the one at the top of your screen, Action for Canada. But all these others are various organizations that are active in pressing for censorship of books in public libraries, censorship of events in public libraries, and for censorship of school libraries and curriculum materials. But in addition to them, there are a lot of locally based so-called parents' rights organizations. These are just a few from across the country that also are trying to say there are things that our kids will see in schools that we as parents don't want them to see, and therefore the school can't have them, or they can't have them without allowing our children to be removed, which undermines the whole purpose of public education. And what we're seeing is the manner of challenges from these groups is changing and getting more and more serious and concerning. So Action for Canada, for example, has taken to reproducing a leaflet, and they go to the opening night when many schools have a parents' night when they welcome parents whose kids are coming to the school for the first time. And representatives from Action for Canada will turn up at these parents' nights meetings with a handout saying, do you realize this school has this disgusting material in its school library or in its curriculum materials, trying to dissuade parents from going to that school and putting pressure on the school to get rid of it. These organizations create petitions. This is a petition to get rid of books from the Winnipeg Public Library. They engage in protests outside the library or outside the school. 2 years ago, the most common protests, the most challenged in public libraries in Canada were drag story time events. They use social media very creatively. This is an image of one of the key spokespeople for Concerned Citizens Canada, which started out as an anti-masking, anti-vaxxer group in Manitoba during the pandemic, has morphed into a group that really focuses on censoring books in school and public libraries. We're seeing more and more vandalism in school libraries and public libraries, particularly of LGBTQ plus positive materials. And then we have legal threats, and Action for Canada is the principal one in that. They are sending around to the CEOs of public libraries, to school boards, and to principals what they call a notice of liability. And it's telling them that they are going to be criminally liable for facilitating the exposure of minors to sexually explicit educational resources, activities, or events. And this bogus legal document starts with the demand that you cease and desist your personal participation in this agenda. It goes on to say that you must immediately remove all the books in the following list, and that the URL there is for a list of 62 books. Actually, the origin of this list was these were books recognized and recommended by the British Columbia Department of Education for teachers as resource materials in dealing with issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. And they're saying you must have immediately removed all the books on this list, any other titles by the same authors, plus any books of the same genre from the school library, from the classroom, from public library, online resources. They also go on, say all educational facilities, including libraries, cease and desist promotion of any and all activities, performers, and clubs that exploit vulnerable minors. This includes prohibiting any and all gay straight alliance clubs, all LGBTQ government and non-government funded NGOs from having access to children. So it's a very aggressive demand, and you're going to see this is the group that actually met with and got the Minister of Education in Alberta to issue his book ban. And this is him, Demetrius Nicolaides. In May, he announced that he had been meeting with some Alberta parents. Now, we subsequently know he had been meeting for months with Action for Canada, who had been pressing him to do what he announced that this day he was going to do, who made him aware of 4 graphic novels that had no place in Alberta schools, and the government would be introducing guidelines to ensure no inappropriate books would be in school libraries as of September. He was adamant the government wasn't embarking upon a widespread book ban. It was just building up missing guardrails. It's not censorship. Now, the one characteristic of censors, going back to those who put Socrates to death in 399 BC, is they always deny that they're engaged in censorship, that what they're doing is they're doing something for the good of the community. After all, Socrates was put to death for corrupting the youth of Athens. And these are the 4 books that he held out as examples and are at the core of what the province wants to get rid of. Now, they have something in common. They all are award-winning books. Blankets has been translated into more than 20 languages. It's received rave reviews, both from library journals and from magazines. Time magazine calls it one of the greatest, a great American novel. The Guardian referred to it as one of the best graphic novels of all time. But these are the ones he chose. So they're not garbage, quite the contrary. In fact, you can go onto the Center for Free Expression website. We have profiles of about 100 of the most challenged books, and you can get the background on them and how they've been reviewed. But that's who he decided to go after. And so on July 4th, he issued his first ministerial order banning all books with explicit sexual content from all levels of all schools in the province. Now, there was a curious exception that was written into the ministerial order, except for religious texts and scriptures. Now, he had a problem. The Edmonton School Board, as all the other school boards did, dutifully complied with the minister's orders, and the Edmonton School Board provided a list of more than 280 books to be removed, as all boards were told to do. They had to identify the books to be removed, let the minister know what those books were going to be, and have them out of the library by September. But that list got leaked to the public. And among the miscreant books to be banned were the ones you see in front of you: Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, Ayn Rand, who I think is an intellectual inspiration to Premier Daniel Smith's. Her Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead were on the list. Alice Walker's The Color Purple, Margaret Atwood, The Diviners, Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Judy Blume, Forever, Isabel Allende, The House of Spirits, and many others. Well, this created an uproar. The minister was getting criticism. The government was getting criticism. Margaret Atwood was so incensed by what happened that she said, I'm going to write a short story for teens that would be deemed suitable for Alberta school libraries, adding that the work was necessary because the province's Minister of Education thought students were, quote, stupid babies. So she wrote a story, and it was about two adolescents named Mary, sorry, it's blocked, my view's partly blocked by the screen, who were very good children. They never picked their noses or had bowel movements or zits, she said at the beginning of her story. They, quote, I'm quoting, they grew up and married each other and produced 5 perfect children without ever having sex. And she added that they were ardent Christians who, quote, paid no attention to what Jesus actually said about the poor and instead, quote, practiced selfish, rapacious capitalism in the vein of conservative literary hero Ayn Rand. Writing that John and Mary lived happily ever after, she concluded her story with, quote, but while they were doing that, The Handmaid's Tale became true, and Premier Daniel Smith found herself with a nice blue dress but no job. A reference to the high-ranking wives of commanders in her book, The Handmaid's Tale, who wore blue while the handmaids in red garments were subjected to produce children for elite couples in a totalitarian and theocratic state. Well, that short story went viral. It was covered in newspapers across Canada and across the world. And it led a very, very embarrassed minister to announce that he was going to pause this book ban indefinitely. Well, the premier didn't like that idea very much. So she came on and almost immediately after he spoke to say, well, we're only pausing it for a few hours. And the only reason we have a problem is because the Edmonton Public Library engaged in vicious compliance. We never meant to go after the classics, as she put it. Well, the few hours turned into more than a month when he issued a revised ministerial order. And the revised ministerial order went after the kinds of books he had begun with, and that is the young adult graphic novels. And that has resulted in challenges of an unprecedented nature, by far the largest book ban in Canadian history. The Centre for Free Expression keeps records for Canada on all the challenges to books in all Canadian libraries, public libraries, school libraries, and academic libraries. And in 2025, there were 433 books challenged across all libraries across the whole country. 74% of them were due to the Alberta ministerial order. Of those 433 books that were challenged, 325 of them were removed. 320 of them were due to the Alberta challenge. So 98% of the books that were removed in all of Canada last year were removed because of Nicoliti's ministerial order. There were only 5 books challenged amongst all the others that were removed. And often those were just simply because they were ones that had gotten into the collection without actually meeting the standards of the library policy. Now, the problems with censorship, and I want to end with this, are that the demands for censorship are really a sign of weakness. A confession by those demanding it is that they can't coexist with divergent ideas, that their demand results from a fear of freedom of expression and public discourse, which is the foundation of a genuine democracy. But secondly, censorship rejects the understanding that in a democracy, we solve problems through public discourse. It's often very difficult, ongoing discussions. I mean, if you think 40 years ago in the city I live in, gay men were being arrested by the hundreds in bathhouses by police across Toronto. And now, 40 years later, we recognize that everyone has a right to love who they want to love and live how they want to live. And that change occurred precisely because of this public discourse, discussions, teach-ins, protests, debates in government. And we moved as a society from one position to a much better one. But it was a result of very difficult discussions. That's the heart of it. And if censorship were allowed to intervene, it would stop that process from happening. If you don't remember anything else from my talk, remember a short way of saying all of this that Salman Rushdie did in an interview with the Los Angeles Review of Books, where he said, a mature society understands that at the heart of democracy is argument. Now, there's a whole bunch of other reasons, however, why censorship is a problem, and that is, forget all the philosophical problems with it, it doesn't work. It's ineffective and often counterproductive. It drives underground or causes reformulation in different, sometimes more determined forms, the very content that it was trying to get rid of. The longest experiment with censorship in human history was what was undertaken by the Catholic Church beginning in the 1540s. They created an index of prohibited books. These were books that the church was going to make sure that nobody in the world would have access to, or at least no Catholics would have access to. And they had a variety of titles for the index. My favorite is the one from 1557, the Index of Authors and Books which have been condemned by the Holy Office of the Roman Inquisition and forbidden in all Christendom as either heretical or suspicious or pernicious. Now they had 400 plus years to make this work and could not, and finally abolished the index in 1966. Censorship has the perverse effect of drawing more attention to the person and ideas of concern. So Nicolaides was really upset, apparently, by these 4 young adult graphic novels. Well, these are the 4 that he wanted banned. Well, there's the holds on them placed in the Edmonton Public Library within 2 days of his announcement. So he couldn't have done more to draw readership to those novels than announcing he wanted them banned. Also, we can create free speech martyrs in the public's mind. This headline from a few years ago captures it better than any way I could describe it. Jordan Peterson, who was able to give up his career as a highly paid full professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, in large part because all the attempts to cancel him led to his becoming so well known that he gave up his career and in the university, is a multi-millionaire now, and gets these tours, and attempts to cancel him only add to his allure to much of his audience. Fourthly, censorship denies the right to see and confront ideas or people, diminishing our ability to develop critical analysis and awareness of points of view that may be of concern to us. And this is, that critical analysis is essential for democratic discourse and decision making. I'll just give you one example of a book that I think is pure garbage, pure misinformation, about how Bill Gates, Big Pharma, are part of a global war on democracy and public health. And it was written by a person I considered a kook at the time. I still consider him a kook, although he's the Secretary of Health of the United States now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for many, many months. A lot of people, from my point of view, would say, well, this should be censored. I think that's absolutely wrong. I want to read that book. I wanted to read that book because I wanted to be able to argue more effectively against it. And I can't do that if I can't read it. Fifth, censorship raises the most critical question. That is, who in a democracy should have the authority to decide what everyone else can see and hear? Because I don't like a book, because I think it's offensive, because I think it's harmful, because I think it takes us in a bad direction. Therefore, I have the right to make sure you don't have access to it. You can't operate that way in a democracy, because if you do, those who are marginalized are always going to lose. If the majority can decide the rules for what everyone else can see and read and hear, then the possibility of a more socially just or a different society goes out the window. And finally, censorship gives the illusion of effective action when it's not an effective action. I'll just take the example of racism. I wish we could get rid of this very serious racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism that we have in our society by simply outlawing racist speech. But in fact, if we're going to get rid of racism, we have to deal with the fundamental cultural, social, and economic inequality in our country. We have to deal with our deeply flawed criminal justice system. Those are far more complex and difficult issues. So if we think, well, we're going to censor racist speech and that's going to solve the problem, we're deluding ourselves. And while I say all that, I want to emphasize that when we reject censorship as a bad way to deal with social problems, that doesn't mean we're off the hook. It just means we're obligated to offer good alternatives to it. I'll just conclude by saying, all this we're talking about is about the price of democracy. Resolving societal differences collectively through dialogue, discussion, and sometimes very difficult discussion, rather than censorship, violence, and coercion, or authoritarian rule. That's the price of democracy. We have to deal with the uncertainty, have the protests, the debates, the difficulty of telling somebody in your family when they tell a racist joke that you find it offensive. That's how we deal with difference, and that's how we make a difference in a democratic society. Or to put the price of democracy in the words of our Supreme Court has, in a decision in 2001, Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin wrote on behalf of the entire court the following: amongst the most fundamental rights possessed by Canadians is freedom of expression. It makes possible our liberty, our creativity, and our democracy. It does this by protecting not only good and popular expression, but also unpopular or even offensive expression. The right to freedom of expression rests on the conviction that the best route to truth, individual flourishing, and peaceful coexistence in a heterogeneous society in which people hold divergent and conflicting beliefs lies in the free flow of ideas and images. If we do not like an idea or an image, we are free to argue against it or to simply turn away. But absent some constitutionally adequate justification, we cannot forbid a person from expressing it. Because of the importance of the guarantee of free expression, any attempt to restrict that right must be subjected to the most careful scrutiny. And to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, the phrase "the most careful scrutiny" means there's a very high bar before we restrict expression in our democratic society. So I'll end there. Thank you very much. If you have any questions that we don't get to in this session, there's my email address. I'd more than welcome you getting in touch with me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide you references to any of the material I've cited. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim, for leading us off this evening. And we now turn to our panel and our panel moderator. Our four panelists this evening are, in alphabetical order, Tim Chi, who is an IB Diploma student in the Edmonton Public School Board; Muen Li, also a student in the Edmonton Public School Board. Muen enjoys exploring the intersection of social advocacy and biological research. Karla Palichuk, director of Yellowhead Regional Library; and Jodi Schwartz, a secondary school English teacher in Edmonton, who is simultaneously completing her PhD at the University of Alberta. Our panel moderator is Dr. Farha Sharif, Director, Center for Research for Teacher Education and Development, Faculty of Education, University of Alberta. And I'll just remind attendees, they are free to post to the Q&A at any portion of the evening, and we'll take questions after the panel has a chance to speak. Over to you, Farha.
Thanks, Tony. Gosh, Jim gave us so much to think about, didn't he? And I'm trying to think about how he left us with this question, who in a democracy should have the authority to decide what everyone else can see and hear? And he talked about the illusion of effective action and how censorship diverts from the real solutions. And so winding back his stories and his scholarship, I'm actually going to turn to Muen and Tim, both of our student panelists, to start the conversation. I would love to hear your thoughts on what the impact of this ministerial order has had on students. Are you talking about it amongst your friends? What are your feelings about it? Maybe we'll start with Muen first.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so to be honest, the effect on our school in particular isn't drastically felt due to the hardworking teachers like Ms. Schwartz, who fights to keep diverse perspectives and acceptance inside of our classroom, right? However, the thing that we, like Tim and I, are most concerned about are the implications that censorship can have on education as a whole and schools who don't have like as relentless teachers as we do, right? So like circling back to one of Dr. Tur's talking points, right? Most books banned inside of schools disproportionately target LGBTQ content. And that's obviously bad, right? Because less exposure to difference breeds intolerance and hate. Youth, a part of the LGBTQ community, have also disproportionately bad mental health outcomes. And this year, the trans legislation imposed by the UCP made it so that they are further ostracized inside of the safe space that school is supposed to be, right? Speaking from personal experience, I know students in my school rip off pride decorations, and that's terrible. Hate is something that we actively need to work towards absolving, and not just like, I guess, relinquishing like further on, right? And I feel like regardless of which side of politics you side on, I feel like we can all agree that it is imperative that students' existence feel justified and safe inside of schools. Research has shown that feeling safe inside of schools also lead to like better learning outcomes and overall quality of life for kids, right? And obviously the book ban disrupts that. The barring LGBTQ representation says to kids like, hey, if you're gay, your existence is not tolerated inside of this classroom. And in 2026, we've been knowing that this is a problem. And I feel like the government should be worrying more about how they can fund education and less on making the lives of kids worse. So that's my take on it.
Thanks, Muen. Tim, did you have other thoughts that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I agree with a lot of what Moon said. But just to build off some of it, a lot of the things we've been talking about are like with regards to books, right? But one thing that I think is not so much talked about is that even if the government decides to ban books, it's not really doing so much, especially for kids maybe our age, because we can access a lot of this stuff just through our cell phones, right? So it's not like we can't be exposed to this. And by, banning books with like, for example, pornographic content, nobody can see it, right? Another point is that some of this legislation, it might not feel so present in, for example, my school because, like Moon said, people like Ms. Schwartz are actively defending our ability to, keep these things in our libraries. But in areas where, for example, in more rural areas where people are more socially conservative or maybe intolerant of, say, more progressive ideas like LGBTQ people and people like that, it's a sort of way to the book bans are often thought of as this way to like signal to these people that the UCP sort of ideologically is aligned with them, right? And of course, that's a politically beneficial thing for them because they rely on them for votes. But the effect that has is like it really creates a lot of fear and intimidation for those kids because in rural areas there is just less people like that, right? Whereas in cities like where I live, there are a lot of people, and there's a lot more awareness and support for LGBTQ people. So for those people, that's I think who suffer the most. Yeah, and that creates just even more intolerance, and it doesn't create change in those areas because not educating and not exposing people to these sorts of perspectives creates it's kind of like teaching like abstinence. Abstinence doesn't necessarily limit prevent people from having like unsafe sex. It's kind of the same thing. People aren't aware of these perspectives and ideas, and it just breeds more intolerance. So yeah, I would say generally that's what I feel.
Thanks, Tim. I'm hearing some very similar but very different perspectives on both of your thoughts as students regarding the ministerial order. And what I think both of you explained really well, and this is where I'll call Jodi into the conversation. You both expressed the importance of having supportive educators who are critical educators. And so, Jodi, I'd love to call you into this conversation to hear about the impact of this ministerial order on teachers. Have you felt it in your school? What are your colleagues saying? Tell us your thoughts.
Was very interesting at the beginning of the year. First, I want to say I am a non-neutral educator. I take a stand and I will die on that hill. At the beginning of the year, when this ministerial order first came out, we panicked. Our school panicked. We have, a couple thousand kids, and now we've got to remove books that we use, that we teach with, that we use to teach critical thinking, which is imperative in a democratic society. And it was a panic at the beginning of the year, and also really disheartening. We felt like a lot of power was being taken away. We felt as if people weren't hearing us, or taking what we were saying and kind of misconstruing ideas. And then, of course, he let go of this order because I guess we fought back a little bit, and we were prepared. We were ready to take those books out. I personally would not take them out of my classroom. I'm going to go right ahead and say that. My classroom library is built by me. I read every single thing I bring into that classroom, as I'm sure all of our English teachers in our school do. And I vetted that stuff. And I know it's going to help kids think more critically. I know it's going to help them see things from different perspectives. I know that it's going to help them question what is happening in the world around them. And isn't that what we want in our young people?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it? And so I think when he came back and said, all right, well, we're going to do this again, I'm not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not doing it, and I will die on that hill. Now I'm older, I've been teaching for a long time. But free speech or free express our ability to have free expression is paramount. Whether we agree with someone else or not, it doesn't matter. We have to hear both sides. That argument is essential in a democratic society. So that's where I stand.
Yeah, Jodi, you're making me think of something Dr. Turk had said earlier. He said, truth is, the ability to understand and hold divergent and conflicting beliefs, right? And put it up to the most careful scrutiny. And what we're talking about here is the ability to think critically. I'm actually going to ask you a follow-up question, if you don't mind, because I think we have some time. What advice would you give to your fellow educators out there who might have less or more anxiety perhaps than you do, or less freedom or feelings of security? What advice would you give to your fellow educators out there who are listening, who are tuning in tonight, around the importance around the ability for us as educators to teach our students to think critically, to be able to understand each other and suspend the need to agree with each other, which is what Muen and Tim are all we are all saying the same thing. So can you give us some advice for fellow educators out there who might be feeling a bit anxious?
It's quite funny because my doctoral research is exactly on this, is how do we get teachers to feel comfortable enough to talk about the difficult things in their classrooms with students, with the general public. And one of the things that, it's very hard for young teachers who don't have contracts, who need to walk the line, follow the rules. And then someone like me who's been around a long time, I have pretty good relationship with my kids. But I would say we have to have these discussions, and they may need to start in small groups in the staff room. I do little things in my classroom every day that shows that I'm non-neutral, that nobody else necessarily sees or hears, but that's my way of fighting back. That's my way of standing up. And we have to, I think, as far as teachers are concerned, you need to start thinking about this. To, um, you need to, I don't want to say you need to, that's a bad way to put it. But I think praxis is very important here. You have to ask yourself every single day, and I ask myself this every single day. What am I saying? What am I doing today that is going to help my students who may feel unseen be seen? What is going to help amplify their voices? Because ultimately, it's not about the teacher in the room.
Mhm.
We are there to facilitate the growth of these incredible students that we have the privilege of working with. Look at these two. Like, are you kidding me? This is a privilege. And I know people that aren't teachers don't always understand this, but it is a privilege and a responsibility that we have that is second to none because we are working with kids.
Mhm.
They're our future.
I think that's a great point that you brought up, and I love the articulation of the moral responsibility that we have as educators. And I think this would be a great time to bring Karla into this conversation, especially around this idea of moral responsibility. Muen and Tim both shared something about and so did Jodi, the importance of protecting the experiences of those who are most marginalized or who might be pushed to the margin. And I'm wondering about, Karla, what the implications are of removing this idea of the ability to think critically or access to materials that help us think critically from society. What effect is that going to have on public libraries and in school libraries? So I'd love to invite you into this part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Some of what I'm going to say might reinforce what has already heard or duplicate what's already been heard, but maybe from a different perspective. When I think about all of this conversation that we've been having about what we should have, what we shouldn't have, voices that should be amplified, voices where the perception is that they haven't been heard. At the end, for me, that comes to where is the anxiety sitting? And Marcus Aurelius said it way better than I can, which is today I escaped from anxiety, or rather, I discarded it because it was within me. It was within my perceptions and not outside of them. My anxieties are my own. They're my responsibility to deal with. If I'm anxious, when I hear something, read something, see something, that's up to me. And I do not have the right to push my anxieties onto other people. So why am I talking about this? Because when we decide that books and words and ideas are harmful to us and they cause us anxiety, we are then imposing our own ideas upon others, including the students. Young people today need to learn that they can feel triggered, offended, angry, upset, or anxious when presented with a different viewpoint or something that is different from their perspective. And they need to learn that they can emerge stronger for it and that they can build resilience and the critical thinking skills that we're going to need. And I say that because these two are going to be the ones who will determine what my retirement looks like. And I need them for my own vested interest to be able to engage with thoughts and ideas and agree and disagree and communicate effectively about these things. We also now have a glut of AI generated content in the marketplace. Books, music, videos, memes. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos yesterday that I thought, oh, this is interesting because I didn't hear this. I had not heard this on the news. And then it took me a while to hear that they were all absolutely the same, just with different heads. And without critical thinking, would I have caught that? Without the ability to stop and say, wait a minute, what a good idea, but this is odd. Critical thinking skills is not now a nice to have. It never has been. It is a need to have. And the only way that we can develop that, the only way we can help the youth develop that, is to allow them to engage with these ideas, thoughts, and images that might challenge beliefs and status quo, and maybe our own anxieties. But let's not put our anxieties on them. Going back to what we've talked about and what we've heard on this panel, as a democratic society, we have to be able to argue and debate ideas, topics, and use our words to solve disputes and debates rather than finding a stick to hit each other over the head with. With regards to public libraries, and my region is very different in Alberta because we just don't support public libraries. I also support 3 school divisions. And so, Jodi, when you talked about your panic and your anxiety when that order came down, we feel you because we had the same thing. But for public libraries, it is very much a reminder, this whole conversation, that we have to sit in the middle. We are not neutral. We are not apolitical. We have to be. But we are balanced. We have to look at what both sides in the debate are saying. We have to be able to hold that middle point firm, collect the material, the ideas, and the debate on both sides, and not allow ourselves to be swinging in any way, shape, or form too far away from that middle peak. If we have those ideas, the information, and the resources to support both sides, and we circulate them without judgment or bias, then we can say to the youth, here's the stuff you might want or might need to read that will challenge your thinking and help you develop the critical thinking skills. Public libraries are about community. Our boards are run by community members. We reflect what the community values and morals are, but that doesn't mean that we restrict ourselves to only one point of view. And everything that has been talked about today just reinforces that that's the role that we need to take. So thank you.
I mean, I think we keep coming up again, like back to this idea of the ability to read something, consume something, view something, understand something, and hold it, and not necessarily feel like we need to agree with it. And if we don't agree with it, that's okay too, right? I really appreciate how you started that conversation with my anxieties are within me and they're my own. They don't necessarily exist for others, because I think we do have a crisis of critical thinking in this day and age where content is being generated so quickly. And for students to be able to read and sustain their attention on something that is difficult and grapple with it and think of these ideas that are different than their own, and to hold space for those ideas that are different than their own, and to be able to really bring their own perspectives and lived experiences and informed knowledge to these conversations, I think is absolutely critical and important for not just students in the in the city, but students who are in rural and more outskirts places in Alberta, to be able to have access to these things, I think is really important. I'm just going to offer one more opportunity for our panelists to have any closing thoughts before we open it up to the audience Q&A, and I'll turn it over to Tony to be selecting the questions. Do any of our panelists want to have any closing thoughts or remarks?
I think I just want to say, oh, I'm sorry, Karla, go ahead.
I have 2, just that words hurt and we protect them because they are powerful and they matter. So let's not forget the powerful nature of what we are trying to achieve here. It's not just the words on the paper. They do come with emotion. They're loaded. And in a free and equal society, you have the right to express your opinion, to get angry, and you also have the right to be wrong.
You have the right.
And so I might be wrong today in what I'm saying. You might not all agree with me, and that's okay.
That's key. We have the right to be wrong. Because I was just talking to my undergraduate students last week, I said, what a different world we would live in if we just had the ability to say, thank you for teaching me that, or that's not something I had thought of before, and let me take that back, or I was wrong. Can you imagine what kind of world we would live in if we could
And
do
I
that?
will and I will also add that in some places in rural Alberta, because that's where I work, there have been conversations where people have left after speaking to the public library to say, I have never thought of it like that.
There is
I'm
hope.
leaving with a different perspective. People, irregardless of where they live, have open minds. They just sometimes need to be on both sides of the debate. We just have to be able to talk to each other respectfully and with clarity and with honesty.
Mhm. And that starts with access, doesn't it? Yeah.
It does.
Jodi, go ahead.
I just wanted to, I have a big sign in my room that says, our words have power. And whenever anything comes up, I refer to that board and say, our words have power. The last thing I wanted to say, this is kind of I don't know if this phrase has been coined, but this is the one I'm using in my research, is that resistance is revolution.
Hmm.
We don't have to be loud. We don't have to be over the top. We just need to sometimes quietly resist. And that is the beginning of revolution.
Thank you. Tim or Muen, any last thoughts before we open it up to audience Q&A?
Yeah. I do a lot of work outside of school with like tutoring. And one of the most like beautiful moments in that sort of in that activity is like seeing the students like finally like understand something and have that like oh moment where their like face lights up. That's to me is one of the most like amazing things ever. And so, building that to build that, I think like we really need to like focus on curiosity and focus on understanding one another. And like Ms. Schwartz said, words have power. And I think that's the way to build that curiosity and that understanding to create a more democratic and just world.
Thank you.
Also have something to add. I noticed that Carlos mentioned like the importance of critical thinking in this day and age, right? And I feel like one of the ways that we can build critical thinking is to have people talk to each other, right? You gotta to be exposed to different perspectives. You need to be able to interact with people. That also brings me back to my previous argument about safe spaces. To feel like you can interact with others and to like have complex discussions which promote critical thinking, you need to have a space where all views and I guess perspectives are welcomed, right? Where we don't really hate on each other for like having a different worldview and perspective on life. So yeah, that's all. So love each other more.
Thank you. And exposure to those ideas, right? Not just living in a vacuum or an echo chamber. Thank you. What a great and robust discussion. I'm going to ask Tony to read our first question, please.
Thank you, Farha. Here is the question, and I think we'll start it with Jim as I read it, and time permitting, other panelists might want to add some thoughts. The question is, and thank you to the attendee who posted, when my district pulls books from our libraries, which are mostly due to LGBTQ plus content, the district tries to give the alternative solution that students can access that book at the public library. Obviously, this is censorship, but how do you believe this should be combated?
Well, I'll start with a quick answer to that. Every school board should have a policy about how it deals with any challenge to a book in its library or in its curriculum. That is, it also should have a policy with regard to how it selects material for the library. So when a challenge comes in, the first thing they do is look at and see, is that book consistent with the policy as to what should be in our library? I mean, a library can't have everything, so it has priorities as to what it collects. And if it is, then they keep the book regardless of how outraged the challenger is about it. And I can't think of any criteria that would cause a book because it's LGBTQ positive to be excluded. So the mere exclusion of the book is absolutely unacceptable if it's consistent with the school board's policy about what should be in the collection. And so I think that, if you're aware of that, then the response is, well, it's available at a public library. Well, there could be censorship of the public library. They say, well, you can always order it from Amazon. That's not, that is censorship. That's not how you work. A lot of young people may feel more comfortable being to look at it in the library, school library, and get it out there. It's more anonymous. And if they're a person questioning their own gender identity or sexual orientation, they may want to read it in a safe space. And a school library is a safer space than a public library, or ordering it from Amazon or whatever. So for the school to do that, it's giving in to the kind of behavior that's unacceptable in a democratic society by a public school board or a separate school board or any publicly funded school board.
I'm wondering if any of the other panelists might want to offer some thoughts.
So James said something that triggered a thought, and this is it. The safety and the accessibility of items in the public library in the school, yeah, absolutely. Censorship, there should be policies, there should be requests for reconsideration, there should be trained people with experience and knowledge of what is appropriate for the youth, the students, to have in the school to meet their needs. That is not done from the top down, that is done from teachers like Jodi and other people who work day to day with these kids. In a public library, it's done by trained librarians with collection development policies and a knowledge of their communities, and not just what is popular, but what also is challenging. Mm-hmm. So we need to maintain that. And as Jim was talking, I thought about an interaction I had last week with a library board who very much wants to maintain the access of challenge materials in the schools in the public library and are planning to do so. And what they also discussed was it might not be safe for these kids to take out the material and bring them home, but we will make sure that it's safe for them to access, read them, and keep them in the public library. And this is a very small community. So, people are already talking about this. So censorship on the school side, yes. Hopefully backstopped until this gets resolved by the public libraries.
That's a very creative way to handle it, right? And I think it protects the students and allows them to still consume the information in ways that is honoring their curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Farah, could I just add one other thing?
Please.
Schools are where all of our young people learn about basic civic values and values of the society. So if the school says, well, censorship here is okay because you can get it elsewhere, they're really saying censorship is okay, which is not the message the school should be delivering, right?
Agreed.
And I guess the last thing I meant to say it in my talk and I didn't. The other problem with the minister's intervention is the decision about what's appropriate for students and at what ages, as you were suggesting, Farah, should be made by professionals who have expertise to do that, by trained educators, by librarians. If what's in our schools or in our public libraries is decided politically, then every time there's a change in government, we could have change in what's going to be. We can't have a proper democracy. We can't have a proper educational system. We can't have a proper public library if political considerations are the basis of decisions of what's in the library.
Mm-hmm. So important. And I think this might be a good time to bring in our second question, Tony.
Absolutely. I think this one, again, we'll start with Jim. And the question is, and it flows nicely from the first question, actually. How does defaulting to the public library as a backup to the school library actually impact the erosion of school libraries and teacher librarians in Alberta and Canada more broadly?
I think the question has the answer embedded in the question. One of the sad things in our country, and certainly in Alberta, is that school boards are underfunded. And one of the results of their underfunding is they see that, well, they have to cut back on something. And so libraries and teacher librarians and library staff are something they can save money on. I would be surprised if 20% of the schools in Alberta have a teacher librarian in them. And so saying, well, we can get into the public library is just a step in the direction saying, well, we really don't even need a school library because after all, everyone in this community can go to the public library and get what they want. Whereas school libraries provide a really unique resource. I'm here today because of a woman who was my teacher librarian in grade 5 who introduced me to libraries and a love of books. I didn't come from a home that had lots of books and so on. And so that part of your educational experience is vital. And so I really worry that that's a slow step in a direction we've already gone far too far along, and that is getting rid of teacher librarians and proper library resources.
Agreed. Gonna offer some wait time to see if any of our other panelists want to try that one.
School libraries provide curriculum support, focus on youth, all of that. The public library has to provide a much broader mandate in terms of supporting the informational, educational, cultural, and recreational needs of the community. The schools are a microcosm of that. So there is some crossover between them, but we're not specialized in what the kids need or want or anything because we have to look bigger than that. So trained teacher librarians, absolutely. And certainly the Library Association of Alberta came down pretty hard in the follow-up from the book ban saying you need to restore, every school needs somebody with expertise in libraries.
Agreed. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. This one might be a good one. Tony.
Okay, this one is going to Jodi, and then of course anyone. I completely agree that words have power, and I want to know how this panel feels about books being studied in English classes with racial slurs, how that should be handled. I have felt that sometimes marginalized students feel unsafe, and the rationale is freedom of speech.
Thanks, Tony.
First of all, I never use racial slurs in my classroom. The N-word can be replaced with black. There are ways to do it that that work. And the fact is there are books that have the N-word in it. I don't think we should ignore it. I actually start my year by talking about connotative values of words. And I use the N-word as my first example. And this is a word we don't say, but here's the reason why. Because if we just look at words, words are words are words. However, when you attach historical meaning and the reason those words were used, you have to take into account that meaning. So that word no longer is just a word. It has a lot more value in it that can be used to oppress, to hurt, to put people in a place where they feel they can't even move out of it in many ways. So I'm very open with my students in terms of, yes, this is a word, but this is why I don't think we should use it. You're on the basketball court. I still don't think you should use it, but that's not up to me. This isn't my classroom. While we're in my classroom, we replace that word, or any words that have that harsh connotation. And what's interesting, when I have kids that will write essays, because I study Martin Luther King, I study, I don't back off of anything. When that word comes up, most students will refuse to use it, and they will refuse to put it in their writing. They usually will use the word black, or if they do use an, they will put stars after, but they don't like to. They are really adamant about not using that word. So I think that's probably a really positive coming from our students, is that they are understanding. But if we don't explain the explicitness behind the why these words are harmful, they know,
I think
you
that's
know?
just it, Jodi. You just explained the importance of teaching the context and that how words can be violence, actually. They are hate speech. And so by not explaining and teaching the context, the history, the lived experiences, the current legacies of the violence of these words, I think students end up using these words with no connotation or no context, and then that violence recreates itself.
But we even talk about like racism because, oh, miss, she's being racist to me. Or I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. We need to look at what racism means. Again, you can't, as an educator in today's world, you cannot back off of these. Like you said, context, context, context.
Thank you. I think this might be a good time to move out of our Q&A portion, Tony, and I would welcome Kenneth to join our conversation and offer some closing words and some words of thanks to our panelists.
Thanks, Farah. On behalf of the Centre for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University and the University of Alberta's Centre for Research for Teacher Education and Development and the School of Library and Information Studies, I want to extend a sincere thank you to Dr. Turk, our panelists, Karla, Jodi, Tim, and Muen, and our moderators, Dr. Farah Sharif and Dr. Tony Samet. Most importantly, thank you to our audience for joining this vital conversation at the political intersection of democracy, public education, publicly funded libraries, and expressive freedoms, including the freedom to read. Defending rights under threat, whether from political action groups or on any point of the political spectrum, institutions, individuals, or governments, is critical if the Canadian democracy is to survive, let alone thrive. Encouraging and engaging in respectful mutual dialogue and difference brings us closer to the conditions necessary for mutual flourishing. A curated resource list is now available for those wishing to dive deeper, and you can find today's recording and a schedule of our upcoming events at CFE starting tomorrow at cfe.torontomu.ca. Thank you for your support for free expression and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.